Hey everybody, this is an entry from Robert J. Alexander's History of International Trotskyism. Um, this piece is called, this entry is titled The Trajectory of the United Secretariat. After June 1963, the United Secretariat, USEC, of the Fourth International remained the largest of the groups purporting to be and to speak for the international Trotskyist movement. It had sections in more countries than did any of its rivals. Its total membership probably exceeded that of any of the other groups, or perhaps of all of them put together. The United Secretariat may be said to have represented, quote, orthodox Trotskyism after 1963. During most of the next 2 decades, it included in its leadership more of the older generation of people whose role as important figures in the movement dated back to the days when Trotsky himself was its chief, or at least to the end of World War II, than did any of the other factions of the movement. Also, in the realm of ideas, it tended to stick closer to the basic notions put forward by Trotsky than did most of its rivals. The United Secretariat, which had been formed by bringing together 2 factions of the movement, continued to be the scene of conflicts between or among different, quote, tendencies. On at least 2 occasions, more or less significant groups broke away to form their own versions of international Trotskyism. The 1965 World Congress. What was labeled the, quote, Second World Congress since reunification and the Eighth World Congress, end quote, met in December 1965. Pierre Franck had noted that the 2.5 years between the reunification Congress and that of December 1965, the United Secretariat had been active in a variety of fields. Among these were campaigns to defend Polish dissidents, particularly 2 young intellectuals, Modzelewski and Kuran. There's a Trotskyist guy from the 80s. I don't know if he was a Socialist Workers Party guy, but his name was, I think it's Colin Baker. Might be Colin Barker, though. Who translated their works into English, and it was kind of like their, promoter in the West. And I plan on reading their book eventually. I think it came out in the 60s. Anyway, just wanted to throw that in there. Who issued, quote, the first programmatic document of the anti-bureaucratic revolution to come out of a workers' state since the days of Trotsky and the left opposition, end quote. It likewise publicized, quote, left-wing dissent within other, quote, workers' states, including the USSR itself, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The United Secretariat also maintained a constant campaign in defense of the Cuban Revolution, as well as extensive efforts on behalf of the Peruvian Trotskyist leader, Hugo Blanco, perhaps saving him from execution through attention they were able to direct toward his case. Finally, the United Secretariat Executive Committee, or the U.S. Wait, hold on. 1 second. Finally, the United Secretariat and its national sections energetically supported the Vietnamese Revolution and opposed growing U.S. intervention there. The December 1965 World Congress was attended by more than 60 people from 25 countries. According to Franck, it demonstrated, quote, that the reunification had been effectively consolidated, the centrifugal forces having been largely overcome. The organization was able to turn most of the forces outward and implement its policies under more normal conditions, end quote. One party that had played a major role in the post-war Fourth International, but which was not represented at the 1965 Congress, was the Lanka Sama Samaja Party of Ceylon. During the previous year, it had decided to enter the coalition government of Miss Bandaranik, Bandaranika, or Bandaranik, and as a consequence was officially read out of the United Secretariat. Several documents were adopted by the Second Congress after reunification. The most significant of these was the General Political Resolution entitled, quote, "The International Situation and the Tasks of the Revolutionary Marxists," end quote. In addition, resolutions dealing with revolution in Africa, the situation in Western Europe, and the Sino-Soviet conflict were discussed and passed. The General Political Resolution began with an analysis of the economy of the capitalist world, noting its long period of prosperity, but predicting that this was about to come to an end. It concluded, quote, "Whatever the stopgap solutions, the imperialist economy will continue to face the dilemma, either a grave crisis of overproduction or mounting inflation in the coming years," end quote. Furthermore, it argued, the people of the Asian and Latin American countries had shared little in the benefits of the boom then drawing to an end. The economies of the, quote, worker states were depicted as having, quote, continued to progress at annual rates of growth considerably above those of the imperialist countries on the average, experiencing difficulties but no recessions, and thus showing the intrinsic superiority of a planned economy founded on the nationalization of the means of production, ... end quote. At the same time, these countries had experienced, quote, the slowing down in growth of national revenue due to the continuing agricultural crisis and ... difficulties in industry ascribable to innumerable breaks characteristic of bureaucratic management, end quote. The resolution then turned to the Vietnam War, quote, "The American aggression against Vietnam constitutes the first open imperialist attack against the territory of a workers' state since the end of the Korean War, ... end quote." And adding that this showed up, quote, "the completely illusory nature of the Khrushchevist concepts of, quote, peaceful coexistence," end quote, peaceful collaboration, end quote, with American imperialism, end quote. It argued that the Vietnam War, quote, shows that despite the existence of nuclear arms and the threat this represents to mankind, the fate of the world in which we live will be decided by force in the international class struggle between the reactionary rulers of the dying capitalist system and the drive of the masses of humanity towards scientific economic planning and the classless social order of the future, end quote. Finally, this point of the resolution severely criticized both the Soviet and Chinese leaders for their, quote, refusing sufficient aid to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and to the National Front for Liberation in South Vietnam, ... end quote. A section of the resolution dealing with, quote, colonial revolution noted that since the last Congress, it had spread, quote, into a series of countries, particularly Southern Arabia, Syria, the Dominican Republic, Colombia, Guatemala, a number of countries in Black Africa, end quote. But that it had also, quote, unquestionably suffered a series of grave defeats, Brazil, the Congo, Indonesia, end quote. Each of these cases was discussed with particular attention being given to that of the Dominican Republic. One passage in this resolution's discussion of the colonial situation foreshadowed a controversy which was to break out in the USEC before its next Congress and was to last for a decade. Quote, the victory of the Cuban Revolution touched off a movement among the revolutionary vanguard in Latin America, essentially based on constructing small nuclei of guerrilla fighters isolated from the masses as a substitute for building a new revolutionary leadership. The vanguard paid a heavy price for these adventuristic experiences, which appeared in the Fidelista current itself, through the useless sacrifice of the most devoted and dynamic elements. But little by little, a more mature conception of armed struggle displaced this putschist tendency, a conception fusing guerrilla struggle, armed mass struggle, and the organization of the masses in pursuit of economic demands. End quote. Special attention in the general political resolution was given to, quote, the Soviet bureaucracy. It noted the growth of, quote, interest groups, end quote, among the bureaucracy, that so far de-Stalinization had not resulted in, quote, a wave of revolutionary action in the Soviet Union, end quote, because, quote, the masses are still affected by political apathy, skepticism, and cynicism concerning socialist theory, a mood from which they are freeing themselves, but gradually, end quote. There was reason for optimism, according to the resolution. Quote, the entire evolution in recent years, the successive divisions more and more apparent within the bureaucracy, the rapid disappearance of illusions and the continued improvements in the position of the masses, the increase in direct struggles, all foster the revival of the mass movement and a rise in political interest, the creation of a new Soviet section of the Fourth International, a rebirth of a Bolshevik-Leninist organization in the USSR, will play an important role in this rebirth of revolutionary consciousness among the Soviet proletariat, end quote. A section on the Sino-Soviet crisis noted in a cursory fashion the evolution of a variety of tendencies among the communist parties. A longish segment devoted to the situation in the United States noted the particular importance of the growing anti-war movement and of the black drive for, quote, equality and emancipation, end quote. Without specifically mentioning the Socialist Workers Party, it endorsed the position of the Socialist Workers Party. Quote, under these circumstances, black nationalism plays a most progressive role in the dynamics of social struggle and has revolutionary implications, end quote. The principal resolution of the 1965 Congress ended with a section on, quote, our tasks, end quote. These were, quote, 1, to strengthen the struggle against the imperialist aggression in Vietnam and for the Vietnamese revolution, and 2, the unconditional defense of all the workers' states, beginning with the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China against imperialism, 3, defense of the revolutionary conquest of Algeria against both imperialist pressure and domestic reaction. 4, defense of revolutionary movements underway such as those in the Congo, Santo Domingo, Venezuela, etc. against imperialist intervention. 5, support to the movement for unilateral nuclear disarmament in the imperialist countries. 6, support to the efforts to achieve a positive outcome to the crisis shaking the international capital C communist movement. The capital C part was me. 7, the Fourth International attaches particular importance to the working and student youth who stand in the vanguard today in a number of countries. End quote. The 1965 Congress resolution on the progress and problems of the African Revolution carried at least some discussion of the situation in virtually all of the African countries. It divided them into, quote, colonial Africa, quote, neocolonial Africa, quote, Africa in revolutionary transformation, and, quote, Mali, Guinea, Ghana, Egypt, and Algeria. There was a particularly long discussion of the evolution of the Algerian Revolution. The resolution on, quote, the evolution of capitalism in Western Europe, end quote, passed by the 1965 Congress is of most interest for its discussion of strategy in its section on our tasks. Quote, the central task of revolutionary Marxists during the entire coming period, insofar as it is objectively determined by the succession of phases of capitalist prosperity and more or less limited recessions, continues to be the one already indicated: to prepare, to justify, to coordinate, to widen and to generalize the struggles of the proletariat in defense of immediate material interests, ... and against the integration of the workers' movement into the bourgeois state apparatus, ... Success in these tasks involves maintaining the orientation of integrating our militants in the mass movement while at the same time maintaining an independent sector. Consequently, entrist work will continue to be applied in the case of the CPS in France and Italy, in the Labour Party in Great Britain, in the SP in Austria, in the SFP in Denmark, in West Germany and Belgium, end bracket, a modification in tactics is called for, ... end quote. The resolution of the 1965 United Secretariat Congress on the Sino-Soviet dispute is summed up by the editorial introduction in the International Socialist Review to the documents of the Congress. Quote, the aim of the document is not to find, quote, reasons for supporting one side or the other, but to ascertain the truth of the situation, the basic cause of the dispute, and its major ramifications. In the process, it emerges very clearly that the position of the Fourth International is independent. Nevertheless, as between Peking and Moscow, the Trotskyist movement leans to the side of the Chinese, end quote. Michel Pablo, for the first time since the European Congress of 1944, did not participate in the 1965 Congress. By the time it was held, he was already outside the ranks of the faction of the International Trotskyism led by the United Secretariat. I wonder if Pablo was still working for the Algerian government at this time. The factional conflict of the 1970s. The beginning of the 1969 to 79 struggle. During the preliminaries leading up to the 1969 Congress of the United Secretariat, there began a controversy within the organization which was to last about a decade, and at one point threatened to bring about a major splintering of the USEC. There are several elements of this controversy which are of particular interest. One element was the fact that the lineup in the 1969 to 79 struggle was roughly the same as that of the 1950s between the International Secretariat and the International Committee. On the one side were, quote, the Europeans, led particularly by Pierre Franck, Ernest Mandel, and Livio Maitan. And on the other were the Socialist Workers Party of the United States and its allies, particularly in Canada, Australia, and Latin America. It is not clear whether this alignment was more or less accidental or whether it in fact had its roots in long-standing political and personal differences between the two groups. Another factor of interest was the apparent reversal of roles which took place during the controversy, which centered basically on the role of guerrilla warfare in bringing about the revolution. It had been the Socialist Workers Party which had first rushed to the enthusiastic support of Castro and had been the first to proclaim Cuba a, quote, workers' state. The Europeans more or less followed the Socialist Workers' Party's lead in this, but in the 1969 to 79 controversy, it was the European leaders who enthusiastically picked up the idea, which Castro had pushed between 1966 and 1968, that guerrilla war was the only acceptable road to the revolution, a notion he had abandoned by the time this fight in the USEC began. On the other hand, it was the Socialist Workers' Party leaders who resisted the generalization of the guerrilla warfare idea. The controversy in the United Secretariat began in November 1968 when a majority of its leadership voted to submit to the forthcoming World Congress a, quote, draft resolution on Latin America, end quote. Joseph Hansen took up the cudgels for the Socialist Workers' Party in opposition to this document, charging, quote, instead of drawing a balance sheet, the draft resolution simply proposes a continental tactic or strategy of technical preparation of and engagement in rural guerrilla war for a prolonged period, end quote. Controversy at the USEC Ninth Congress. The first major clash between the two tendencies occurred at the Ninth Congress, third Congress since reunification in April 1969. This meeting was attended by about 100, quote, delegates and observers from 30-some countries. As usual, the Ninth Congress adopted a number of basic documents. These included the General Political Resolution, the special ones dealing with the Cultural Revolution in China, quote, worldwide youth radicalization, end quote, and the situation in Latin America. It was over this last document that the principal clash took place between the two tendencies represented at the Congress. The General Political Resolution, entitled, quote, Resolution on New Rise of the World Revolution, end quote, argued that there was a, quote, new revolutionary upsurge, end quote, then underway. It reiterated the analysis of 4 years earlier that the long economic boom in the capitalist world was drawing to a close, and that after a long period of quiescence, the revolutionary movement was on the march once again in the, quote, imperialist, end quote, countries. This was indicated not only by the student worker uprising in France in May 1968, but by the general upsurge of student radicalization in the capitalist countries, the widespread movement against the Vietnam War, and by the increasing militancy of the black struggle in the United States. The basic argument of this resolution is best summed up in the following passages. Quote, the new revolutionary upsurge in Western Europe does not mean that the colonial revolution has lost its importance. This new revolutionary rise means that essentially proletarian forces and vanguard political currents carrying on the traditions of revolutionary Marxism and workers' democracy will be in the thick of the fight, that their methods of intervening, of action, and organization will draw much closer to the Leninist norm of proletarian revolutions, This will have a profound influence on the course and the forms both of the colonial revolution and the political revolution in the bureaucratically deformed or degenerated workers' states. The same course will arouse the American proletariat, whose entry on the scene will be the decisive factor in preventing nuclear war from being unleashed by imperialism, It will greatly favor the construction of the Fourth International, end quote. There was extensive debate over the resolution on the Chinese Cultural Revolution. The document finally passed by a margin of 3-1 was a more or less general analysis of the, quote, contradictions. within the Chinese Communist regime, resulting in the Great Cultural Revolution, which is declared to be essentially a conflict within the ruling bureaucracy. Well, at least they got something right. Two minority resolutions urged endorsement of the Maoists and the anti-Maoists led by Liu Shaoqi, respectively. There also developed some controversy over the Youth Resolution. Joseph Hansen later summed up this document saying that it dealt with, quote, how the revolt of the youth had swept many countries, and how we as Trotskyists had become engaged in this movement in many countries, ... From this, we had drawn the conclusion that the main task facing the world Trotskyist movement in the immediate period following the Congress was to turn all its resources, insofar as they are available, to our main task, toward becoming preoccupied with this field of work, that is, among the radicalizing youth, ... This is the first time that the Trotskyist movement had proposed a series of transitional slogans for this field. End quote. Some of the French delegates argued against the resolution. Hansen reported that, quote, another argument against the document was that it was non-interventionist, that it was sort of propagandistic and did not propose direct intervention in struggles, how to intervene precisely. This was raised by some of the French comrades and was really part of their position that the document was not thoroughly enough worked out. But I also think that their argument that the document was not interventionist was probably related to their feeling that the main axis of work in the immediate period should be preparation for guerrilla war and engagement in guerrilla war where possible. End quote. Controversy over the Latin American resolution. The principal controversy and the clearest alignment of the Congress along tendency or factional lines came over the resolution on Latin America. This document maintained a variety of propositions, that there was intensified penetration by, quote, imperialist corporations, end quote, into the Latin American economy, that because of their close association with these corporations, the native industrialist class was unable and unwilling to fight imperialism, that all reformist movements in the region were bankrupt. It held that, the, quote, betrayal of established trade union leaderships and severe persecution of those leaders who were not traders, and the increased readiness of the United States to use force against the revolution in Latin America dictated that what the line of the Fourth International ought to be in the area. This resolution proclaimed that, quote, the fundamental perspective, the only realistic perspective for Latin America is that of an armed struggle which may last for long years. This is why the technical preparation cannot be conceived merely as one of the aspects of the revolutionary work, but as the fundamental aspect on a continental scale, and one of the fundamental aspects in countries where the minimum conditions have not yet been met. End quote. The resolution discarded the possibility of alternative ways to power. Quote, revolutionary Marxists cannot conclude ... that the, quote, classical variant, calling for a progressive rise and broadening of the mass movement and its structuring and reinforcement through traditional organization forms before it reaches the armed struggle, has been revalidated. In ... in reality, the adversary is in no wise ready to allow a mass revolutionary movement to organize more or less legally or normally ... The exceptional variant of an explosive crisis involving the breaking up or paralysis of the state apparatus and a mass mobilization so impetuous that it could prevent or neutralize recourse to repression as a decisive measure, cannot be categorically excluded, but a strategy on a continental scale cannot be based on exceptional phenomenon, ... Even in the case of countries where large mobilizations and class conflicts in the cities may occur first, civil war will take manifold forms of armed struggle, in which the principal axis for a whole period will be rural guerrilla warfare, the term having primarily a geographical military meaning and not necessarily implying an exclusively peasant composition of the fighting detachments, ... In this sense, armed struggle in Latin America means fundamentally guerrilla warfare, end quote. To deal with objections that there didn't seem to be a place in such analysis and prescription for the Leninist type of party, the resolution said, quote, while it is necessary to reject the schematic and paralyzing conception according to which everything hinges on the preliminary existence of a genuine party with all its traditional structures, ... The two following fundamental facts must, however, never be lost sight of. A. The existence and functioning of a revolutionary party, far from being an outworn schema of outmoded Marxists, corresponds to the concrete and eluctable needs of the development of the armed struggle, ... B. The revolutionist must struggle for the most favorable variant, acting in such a way that when the armed struggle begins, if there is not already a genuine party, completely structured, with a large mass influence, a very unrealistic perspective in almost all of the Latin American countries in existence, there is at least solid nuclei of political organization coordinated on a national scale, ... end quote. Joseph Hansen noted subsequently that, quote, the vote on this resolution was 2-1 in favor of the comrades who favored the guerrilla war strategy. 1/3 of the delegates were against it, end quote. He concluded that the majority for this point of view was provided particularly by the youthful French delegates, quote, heavily influenced by the whole general aura surrounding Che Guevara, ... end quote. And the largest part of the Latin American delegates. However, one element among the Argentines, that of Nahuel Moreno, was opposed. The principal argument against the majority position on Latin America was presented by Hansen. One can gather from some of his subsequent writings the nature of the arguments which Hansen made at the 1969 Congress. First of all, he argued that the majority of the Congress was confusing strategy and tactics, and in doing so were turning their backs on traditional Trotskyist positions. He wrote that, quote, what is primary in revolutionary strategy, the minority maintained, is building a combat party. Resorting to guerrilla warfare should be regarded as a secondary, tactical question, end quote. Second, Hansen argued that the majority of the Congress were mistaken in thinking that in advocating a generalized strategy of guerrilla warfare in Latin America, they were following the Castroite lead. Later, Hansen wrote that, quote, at the World Congress, the majority counted on the Cubans continuing to do what they had done in the case of the guerrilla front opened by Che Guevara in Bolivia. This was a hazardous calculation, the minority maintained, because the full consequences of the defeat of Che had yet to be measured. In particular, the Cubans might be in the process of reassessing their line in Latin America in view of the repeated setbacks that had been experienced. If the Cubans were to undertake a reorientation, the minority pointed out, then the resources available to the small groups still committed to carrying out the old line would become even more limited. To plunge ahead despite this change in the situation would prove to be exceedingly ill-advised." End quote. In the third place, Hansen and the minority at the Congress argued that the adoption of such a position on Latin America was, quote, ultra-leftism, and would make it hard to avoid generalizing the arguments of the majority resolution to cover much of the rest, if not all, of the world. Later, Hansen wrote that, quote, "Comrade Maitan is vexed at my conclusion that the course prescribed by him and made official in the Latin American resolution represents a concession to ultra-leftism. I stated further, and I see no reason to change this opinion, quote, consistent application of the course charted by Comrade Maitan would prove disastrous for the Fourth International. The line could hardly be confined to Latin America or even the colonial world generally. For the same ultra-left tendencies to which the adaptation has been made are operative in the imperialist centers. Fostering an ultra-left course in Latin America would surely be paralleled by permissiveness towards ultra-leftism, if not worse, in the imperialist centers. In fact, there is evidence that this has already been occurring in the quite different context of conditions in Britain." End quote, end quote. Extension of the factional struggle. The factional fight which had broken out before and during the 1969 World Congress continued in the years that followed. However, until a December 1972 plenum of the International Executive Committee, the two contending groups had no formal tendency organizations. At that meeting, a document entitled, quote, "Argentina and Bolivia, the Balance Sheet," end quote, which discussed the failure of guerrilla activities in those two countries, was submitted over the signatures of Hansen and Peter Camejo, or Camejo, Camejo, of the Socialist Workers Party of America, Hugo Blanco of Peru, and Anibal Lorenzo and Nahuel Moreno of the Argentine Partido Socialista de los Trabajadores. This document did not serve to change the minds or positions of the majority in the United Secretariat leadership. Shortly after the December 1972 IEC meeting, those who had submitted the document on Bolivia and Argentina issued a call for the formal establishment of an international tendency opposed to the position on guerrilla warfare. At a meeting in Santiago, Chile in March 1973, such a group, the Leninist Trotskyist Tendency, LTT, was organized. Meanwhile, the groups supporting the majority at the December 1972 plenum also organized, taking first the name IEC Majority Tendency and then changing it to the International Majority Tendency, IMT. Subsequently, the lines between the two groups hardened. Leslie Evans has noted that, quote, later in 1973, the LTT came to the conclusion that the IMT, the International Majority Tendency, was in fact functioning as a secret faction, deciding its positions through prior caucus meetings before bringing them into the leading bodies of the International, carrying on its own internal discussion outside the regular channels of international communication, etc. This posed the danger that the faction body that controlled the majority vote in the leading committees was beginning to regard itself as, quote, the real, end quote, International, where all important discussions and decisions were made, while the elected leadership bodies of the International were becoming simply a forum for the presentation of previously decided questions pushed through by a block vote, ... Such a situation could even lead to a split in the International, end quote. As a consequence, the LTT decided to transform itself from a, quote, tendency to a, quote, faction, taking the name Leninist Trotskyist Faction, LTF. According to Evans, the purpose of this change was, quote, to exercise some discipline over its own adherents in order to forestall any ill-considered actions from its own side in the dispute, end quote. The 1974 World Congress. The factional struggle in the United Secretariat continued during the 10th World Congress, which met in February 1974. Hansen noted that, quote, a notable feature of the Congress was its size. About 250 persons were present, representing organizations in 41 countries, ... The growth was accounted for in part by the appearance of new groups in countries where Trotskyist ideas were previously little known, ... end quote. Virtually all of the motions discussed at the Congress were bitterly debated between the two major factions, with a much smaller group known as the Mezryanka tendency, Mezhrayyonka, also contributing to the controversy. It is sufficient here to discuss the arguments over two of the motions which were debated, that is, the general political resolution and one dealing with Latin America. In both cases, competing positions were put forward by the International Majority Tendency and the Leninist Trotskyist faction. The general political resolution, which was submitted by the International Majority Tendency, was adopted by the Congress with 142 votes against 124 in opposition and 4 abstentions. It started with a discussion of the end of the long period of prosperity in the capitalist economy and the overall decline in the relative position of United States, quote, imperialism, end quote. It then underscored the continuation of the, quote, revolutionary rise, end quote, then supposedly underway in Western Europe and Japan, and prospects for the same kind of development in North America. The resolution then noted the alleged growth of the role of proletarian elements in the revolutionary politics of the colonial and semi-colonial countries. This was followed by a discussion of the continuing crisis in the, quote, workers' states, their moves toward reintroduction of the market at the alleged expense of the workers, but also stressed the relative immobilization in the Soviet Union. It professed to see a forthcoming intermingling of the socialist revolution in Western Europe and the anti-bureaucratic revolution in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Much emphasis was given in this resolution to the appearance of a, quote, new mass vanguard on a world scale, end quote, for the first time since the founding of the Comintern, and on the need for the Trotskyists to acquire leadership of this element. In this connection, it speculated on the danger that right turns in the policies of the Chinese and Cuban leaderships might destroy this new mass vanguard. In listing the tasks of the International in the next period, the resolution included a call for a, quote, modernization of the transitional program. The orientation and content of the counter-proposal presented by the Leninist Trotskyist faction was basically different from that of the majority. It was defeated at the Congress by a vote of 118 to 147, with 4 abstentions and 1 not voting. The LTF draft started with a discussion of the world oil crisis, noting the havoc that it had caused in Europe, Japan, and the colonial and semi-colonial countries. It urged that the Trotskyists take advantage of the crisis to push not only their old, quote, transitional slogan, end quote, of a sliding wage scale to keep up with inflation, but add the additional slogan of, quote, sliding hours, a, quote, sliding hours system to take care of the growing unemployment situation. A major part of the Leninist Trotskyist faction draft stressed that, quote, the world revolution resumes its main course, end quote, after a, quote, long detour, through guerrilla war and peasant revolt based on the Chinese and Cuban models. It stressed, quote, the city reasserting its hegemony over the countryside, end quote. Although it didn't, quote, reject guerrilla warfare under all circumstances, end quote, the document said that the Fourth International, quote, views the utilization of guerrilla warfare as a tactical question to be weighed in the light of concrete situations that may arise in the course of struggle. What the Fourth International does oppose under all circumstances is the view that a small group can bypass the arduous task of constructing a Leninist-type party by substituting for the masses in armed struggle, end quote. The draft then went on to stress the need of the proletariat for, quote, allies in carrying out the revolution. These included the movements for national liberation, even in Europe and the United States, rebellious youth, and the women's movement. The draft included a considerable critique of the Cuban situation. It criticized the, quote, retreat by the Castro forces vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. It also commented that, quote, it must be acknowledged that the Cuban Revolution has not realized its initial potentialities in helping to resolve the crisis of proletarian leadership internationally. In serious respects, the Cuban leaders have fallen back while dangerous bureaucratic tendencies continue to gather headway, end quote. The LTF document contained a long section on the Vietnam War. It stressed the effect of the war on undermining United States society. The section of the Leninist Trotskyist faction draft which most emphasized the differences with the international majority tendency was that entitled Maturing of Subjective Conditions for Revolution. It stressed that, quote, the subjective conditions required for transcending the pre-revolutionary period of agitation, propaganda, and organization have not changed qualitatively since 1938. No party adhering to the Fourth International has yet won a majority of the working class or of its militant vanguard. The Fourth International still stands at the stage in which the primary task is the accumulation of cadres, end quote. From this fact, the draft concluded that, quote, the framework of tasks is set by the frank and clear-sighted recognition that the central problems facing the Fourth International are those associated with the growth of small revolutionary propaganda organizations and not those faced by seasoned revolutionary parties of the masses about to take power, end quote. The draft condemned shortcuts to revolution. It particularly denounced the emphasis on guerrilla war. Quote, the last World Congress, it must now be acknowledged, took an incorrect position in relation to guerrilla warfare by adopting an orientation which called on the sections of the Fourth International in Latin America to prepare for and to engage in it as a strategic line, end quote. There was also strong controversy over the specific question of Latin America, which was also embodied in two competing documents. The International Majority Tendency resolution on the subject was adopted by a vote of 142 to 125, with one abstention and two not voting. The International Majority Tendency resolution began with the assertion of the basic correctness of the Ninth Congress position on guerrilla warfare in Latin America. It then listed among the elements of the, quote, primary duty of revolutionary Marxists, end quote, that they should, quote, continually warn the masses against any illusion that they can escape armed confrontation by extending their democratic or economic struggles. It is precisely the stepping up of the mobilization that makes armed confrontation inevitable in the short run, in the present social, economic, and political conditions in Latin America, end quote. It called on the Latin American sections, quote, to untiringly popularize the necessity for the general arming of the workers and poor peasants in self-defense bodies that can develop into workers, peasants, and people's militias, end quote. It stressed specific moves to be taken to launch the, quote, armed struggle, end quote. One was, quote, not to rest content with general and abstract propaganda in this area, but to undertake initial pilot projects, to enter into preliminary actions that are carefully calculated for the effect they can have in raising the level of consciousness of the masses, increasing their combativity, and their will and capacity for arming themselves, end quote. Another task was that of, quote, forming armed detachments of the party, end quote. The Leninist Trotskyist faction alternative draft on Latin America was defeated by a vote of 118 to 143, with 6 abstentions and 3 not voting. It stressed that, although the Trotskyists had traditionally emphasized the need for the use of violence in the revolution, they always stressed that it would be mass violence. Quote, it is not the mobilization and organization of tens of millions of people. The concept is one of immense boldness, a perspective of organizing the masses by the millions, ... By what strategy is this aim to be achieved? It is through the construction of a mass revolutionary party, an instrument interlocked with the masses and thereby in position to provide them with leadership at each stage of the struggle, end quote. However, the Leninist Trotskyist faction draft claimed that the International Majority Tendency document, quote, revises the Trotskyist position. It reaffirms the guerrilla orientation adopted at the 1969 Congress. At the same time, it seeks to make that orientation more palatable. ... What is referred to in the resolution ... is not armed struggle as initiated and carried out by the majority of the population, but violent actions initiated and carried out by small groups. Such actions are supposed to serve as examples to the masses, end quote. The International Majority Tendency proposal put, quote, emphasis on the action of minuscule groups. In reality, that is all the resolution deals with. The action of minuscule groups isolated from the masses, end quote. The Leninist Trotskyist faction draft also argued that the blanket endorsement of guerrilla war for Latin America by the majority, if valid for that region, ought logically to be expanded throughout the world. It argued that, quote, if it is true that the bourgeoisie will grant concessions in face of small mobilizations, as the resolution states elsewhere, but will seek to smash big mobilizations, doesn't that hold for Western Europe and for the United States, end quote? Finally, the Leninist Trotskyist faction document claimed that the acceptance of the guerrilla line by the Fourth International had been due largely to the influx of young people into the Fourth International who were inspired by the Chinese, Vietnam, and Cuban revolutions, but not by the Russian Revolution. Furthermore, it said a number of old-timers who should have known better had acquiesced to the youngsters. Denouement of the factional conflict of the 1970s. Hansen noted that after the 10th Congress that there had been extensive negotiations between the International Majority Tendency and the Leninist Trotskyist faction before the meeting to assure its orderly procedure, and that there had also been accord between the two groups concerning the policy to be followed after the Congress. It had been agreed to suspend further discussion on the issues voted on at the Congress for 1 year, to maintain discussion in a monthly international discussion bulletin on the Chinese Cultural Revolution, youth radicalization, the women's movement, the Middle East, Vietnam, and Eastern Europe. It was also agreed to hold the next Congress within 2 years. Another part of the agreement between the two factions introduced an innovation in the Fourth International. It gave recognition to the fact that rival, quote, sections representing the two factions had come into existence. Although it instructed the IEC to use all its influence to bring about a merger of these groups, it also provided that, quote, at the Congress, Fourth Internationalist groups already existing separately were recognized regardless of their size as sympathizing groups. But this exceptional measure was not to be regarded as a precedent, end quote. The 11th Congress did not, in fact, take place until November 1979. During the intervening period, a number of events transpired which ultimately brought the conflict between the International Majority Tendency and the Leninist Trotskyist faction to an end, but which also resulted in a substantial split in the United Secretariat. One relatively minor development following the 1970 World Congress was the breaking away from the United Secretariat of the Third Tendency, which had stood apart from both the International Majority Tendency and the Leninist Trotskyist faction at the Congress, and had been led by Italian Roberto Massari. Soon after the 10th Congress, Massari split the Italian affiliate to form the Lega Comunista. He then took the lead in establishing the Necessary International Initiative, NII, a kind of, quote, opposition to USEC, conceived of as having a similar role to that of the left opposition to the Comintern in the early 1930s. A third tendency faction in Great Britain, and the Spartacus Bund, which had earlier broken away from the German United Secretariat affiliate, were among the groups participating in the Necessary International Initiative. We have no information concerning how long the Necessary International Initiative continued in existence. One of the most significant events of the period after the 10th Congress was a split in the Leninist Trotskyist faction, which took place in February 1976. At that time, several of the Latin American sections which had been associated with the Leninist Trotskyist faction broke away from it in disagreement with the Leninist Trotskyist faction's position on developments in Portugal following the 1974 revolution there. They formed the Bolshevik tendency. The principal figure of this tendency was Hugo Bersano, who is more generally known by his party name Nahuel Moreno, the main leader of the Argentine Partido Socialista Los Trabajadores. Before the 11th Congress, the Bolshevik tendency was to abandon the United Secretariat and establish its own separate branch of international Trotskyism. Meanwhile, in August 1975, the Leninist Trotskyist faction steering committee issued a call for the dissolution of both factions, saying that, quote, If there are guarantees for a full, free, and democratic discussion, there is no need for a factional structure. While ideological tendencies are still called for because of the political differences, there would be no objective need to maintain the factions in order to have the necessary discussion. End quote. This suggestion was turned down at the time by the international majority tendency. A number of new issues of dispute between the two factions subsequently arose. These included the attitude to be taken toward the Portuguese Revolution, where the international leadership of the international majority tendency favored an alliance with the left wing of the Armed Forces Movement, MFA, and the Leninist Trotskyist faction urged the Portuguese Trotskyists to have nothing to do with the Armed Forces Movement, MFA, and to issue a call for a socialist communist government instead of one dominated by the military. Another source of disagreement was the relations between the United Secretariat and the Lambertist International Tendency, the organizing committee for the reconstruction of the Fourth International, CORQI. The organizing committee for the reconstruction of the Fourth International approached the United Secretariat for discussions with a view to the possibility of reunification of the two groups. The Leninist Trotskyist faction favored such discussions. The international majority tendency opposed them. Finally, the old, quote, organizational issue, end quote, also was raised. The Leninist Trotskyist faction complained that the United Secretariat was attempting to interfere in the internal affairs of various sections to a degree not provided for in the statutes of the international organization, and that in some of the European sections it was beginning to purge leaders of the Leninist Trotskyist faction. However, at a point at which, if previous experiences of the Fourth International were to give any indication, a complete split between the two factions seemed a possibility, if not a likelihood. The situation suddenly changed. In part, at least, this was due to increasing differences which were tending to develop within both the international majority tendency and the Leninist Trotskyist faction. In part, too, it was undoubtedly due to a reassessment by the European leaders of the issue which had been the cause of the original differences in the United Secretariat. The endorsement of guerrilla warfare as the basic strategy of the organization, at least in Latin America. In December 1976, the steering committee of the International Majority Tendency published a document of, quote, self-criticism, end quote, the key paragraph of which was the following, quote, At the Ninth World Congress, we paid the price for this lack of systematic analysis of the Cuban Revolution. On the basis of rapid and hasty generalizations, we did not clearly oppose the incorrect lessons drawn from the Cuban Revolution by the great majority of the Latin American vanguard. Even though what had really happened in Cuba provided us the necessary means, we did not adequately combat the idea, which caused so many deaths and defeats in Latin America, that a few dozen or a few hundred revolutionaries, no matter how courageous and capable, isolated from the rest of society, could set in motion a historic process leading to a socialist revolution, end quote. A few months later, in August 1977, the steering committee of the Leninist Trotskyist faction proclaimed the unilateral dissolution of its group. 3 months after that, the International Majority Tendency also dissolved. Subsequently, leaders of the two groups worked together to draft the major documents of the 11th Congress of the United Secretariat. The definitive end of this long controversy came at the 11th Congress with the adoption of a new resolution on Latin America. It was passed with a vote of 94 in favor, 11 against, 3.5 abstentions, 4.5 not voting. The key portion of that resolution read, quote, "The Fourth International promoted an incorrect political orientation in Latin America for several years, ... As a result of this erroneous line, many of the cadres and parties of the Fourth International were politically disarmed in the face of the widespread, but false, idea that a small group of courageous and capable revolutionaries could set in motion a process leading to a socialist revolution. The process of rooting our parties in the working class and oppressed masses was hindered. The line that was followed, ... led to adventurous actions and losses from our own ranks, ... end quote." One second. The Morenoist split in the United Secretariat. Before the ending of the conflict within the United Secretariat between the International Majority Tendency and the Leninist Trotskyist faction, a new split had developed. As a consequence of that new struggle, a division of some consequence took place in the USEC shortly before the 11th Congress. Two elements were involved in this new division in the ranks of international Trotskyism. One of these was the Bolshevik tendency. The other was a new Leninist Trotskyist tendency made up principally of dissidents from the United Secretariat's affiliate in France. The Bolshevik tendency was the more important element in the 1979 split. The principal figure in the Bolshevik tendency was Nahuel Moreno, a veteran of the Trotskyist movement. Moreno had led a split in the United Secretariat affiliate in Argentina, the Partido Revolucionario de los Trabajadores, PRT, when the group opted for guerrilla warfare in 1968. His faction had merged with a splinter from the Argentine Socialist Party to form the Partido Socialista de los Trabajadores, which during the 1970s was one of the world's numerically strongest Trotskyist parties. Because of Moreno's alignment against the United Secretariat majority's general endorsement of the guerrilla war strategy for Latin America, Moreno's group was given only, quote, sympathizer status in the United Secretariat in its 1969 Congress. Even though the PRT had withdrawn from the Trotskyist movement, the 1974 Congress again refused to recognize the PST as its full-fledged Argentine section. However, Moreno and the PST had several other Latin American sections of the United Secretariat aligned with them. The documents issued by the leaders of the USEC's affiliates in Argentina, Venezuela, Peru, Mexico, and Uruguay in February 1976, announcing the launching of the Bolshevik tendency, attacked both the International Majority Tendency and the Leninist Trotskyist faction. Its arguments against the International Majority Tendency started with a general indictment of its policy since the Ninth World Congress in 1969. It categorized as, quote, ultra-leftist both the endorsement of guerrilla warfare as certain in Latin America and the orientation of the United Secretariat after the 1974 Congress toward a new, quote, broad vanguard, which supposedly had appeared since the 1960s. More specifically, the Bolshevik Tendency statement argued that the error of the International Majority Tendency orientation had been most clearly demonstrated in the Portuguese Revolution. There, the International Majority Tendency supporters sought to recruit principally among various far-left groups which appeared instead of among the followers of the mass socialist and communist parties. They also followed the other far-left groups in, quote, tailing the communists, particularly in the unsuccessful coup of November 1975, in which the communists cooperated with some officers of the armed forces movement. The Bolshevik tendency accused the Leninist Trotskyist faction, and particularly the U.S. Socialist Workers Party, of being, quote, reformist. On the specific issue of the Portuguese Revolution, it attacked the, quote, reformists for allegedly aligning too closely with the Socialist Party. Another accusation against the Socialist Workers Party proved to be curious in the light of what occurred a few years later. It was that, quote, they show the most eager interest in Lambertism, with which any union will be difficult in view of the degree of ossification its sectarianism has reached, end quote. Subsequent to establishment of the Bolshevik tendency, which later took the name Bolshevik faction, it continued to quarrel with both of the other elements of the United Secretariat. In a declaration and platform of the Bolshevik faction, published in July 1979, for instance, it said concerning the international majority tendency that, quote, before, it joined forces with a leftism of a radicalized vanguard in which students were preponderant. Now they submit to the pressure of Euro-communism and a trade union and middle-class vanguard which serve as transmission belts for a liberal ideology and public opinion of the imperialist countries. This capitulation is what has made possible the convergence between the ex-international majority tendency and the leaders of the Socialist Workers' Party, what is to say, the ex-Leninist Trotskyist faction, end quote. 1 second. The United Secretariat after the Morenoist split. For a short while after the exit of Nahuel Moreno and his faction, unity seemed more or less to reign within the United Secretariat, as was demonstrated at the 11th World Congress in November 1979. In the early 1980s, still another factional struggle began within the organization, however. From an ideological and programmatic point of view, this was the most serious controversy in the movement's history, involving, as it did, challenges to the fundamental tenets of international Trotskyism. The 11th World Congress, fifth since reunification, met in Belgium between November 17th and 25th, 1979. It was reported that delegates were present, quote, representing sections and sympathizing organizations in 48 countries in Europe, Asia, America, Oceania, the Caribbean, and North and South America. There were about 200 people in attendance, end quote. Mary Alice Waters, a leader of the Socialist Workers' Party, said that, quote, the large majority vote for the European resolution also indicated a series of differences over the tasks of our movement in Europe, which had emerged during the international majority tendency, Leninist Trotskyist factional struggle, had been resolved. The resolution of the long internal struggle in the international and the dissolution of the two major factions represented a major victory, end quote. Just a reminder that the Socialist Workers Party here is referring at this time to the American Socialist Workers Party, not the very prominent UK Socialist Workers Party of today. Although there was clearly debate and controversy during this World Congress, there did not exist the kind of hard and fast factional divisions which had marked the 9th and 10th Congresses. Most of the resolutions adopted by the meeting were passed with very substantial majorities. For example, the vote on the major political resolution, the world political situation and the tasks of the Fourth International, introduced by Ernest Mandel, was 92 in favor, 7 against, 11.5 abstaining, and 2.5 not voting. The major innovation in this document was, quote, the turn to industry, which was proclaimed the most important, quote, immediate task of the United Secretariat. On this there was a separate vote of 95 for, 9 against, 6.5 abstentions, 2.5 not voting. Perhaps even more significantly, the, quote, resolution on Latin America, end quote, which repudiated the United Secretariat's 10-year-long strategy position in that area, was passed 94 to 11, with 3.5 abstentions and 4.5 not voting. A number of other resolutions were passed by the 11th World Congress. These included documents on women's liberation, the situation in Europe, problems of winning youth to the revolution, as well as resolutions on Nicaragua and Indochina. Finally, there were 2 resolutions discussing the Trotskyist position on socialism and democracy, which we have cited earlier in this volume. During 1981, there began another major controversy between the principal European figures in the United Secretariat and leaders of the United States Socialist Workers Party. These exchanges involved extensive repudiation by Socialist Workers Party leaders of some of the basic tenets of Trotskyism, and defense of Trotskyist theories by some of the European leaders. The most important documents were by Doug Jenis, editor of The Militant, and by Ernest Mandel, and appeared in the International Socialist Review supplement of The Militant, and in Quatrième International, the publication of the United Secretariat. This controversy began with an article by Doug Jenis entitled Our Political Continuity with Bolshevism. In that piece, Jenis argued that Lenin had always advocated combining the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions in Russia. He maintained that in pre-revolutionary Russia, there were only 2 trends in the socialist revolutionary movement. That of the Mensheviks, who favored collaboration with the democratic bourgeois reformists, and the Bolsheviks led by Lenin, who favored rapid conversion of the bourgeois democratic revolution into the proletarian revolution. In essence, without saying so explicitly, he was arguing that the, quote, permanent revolution concept was one Lenin had always supported. Ernest Mandel rebutted Jenis's article, arguing that there were in fact 3 strands in the pre-revolutionary Russian socialist movement: the Menshevik position, that of Lenin, and that of Trotsky. Both Lenin and Trotsky, he said, were opposed to alliance with bourgeois parties in the pre-revolutionary period. However, Lenin favored socialist participation in the provisional revolutionary government for the purpose of carrying out the bourgeois revolution, bracket, establishment of a republic and political democracy, and enactment of agrarian reform, end bracket, after which the Workers' Party would enter into a long period of opposition until capitalism matured and socialist revolutionary forces developed the capacity to carry out the socialist revolution. Sorry, one moment. Doug Jenis replied, arguing that Lenin never foresaw a long period of capitalist democratic revolution after overthrow of the Tsarist regime. He also maintained that Lenin had been right in advocating a workers' and peasants' government, which at its beginning would include all the peasants and subsequently only the poorer peasants as social conflicts developed in the countryside. He claimed that is what happened in 1917 to 18. Jenis insisted that Trotsky had been wrong in arguing that it wasn't possible to work with the peasants, and that he had largely ignored their revolutionary potential. He added that Trotsky had also been wrong in his position towards World War I when he had held the slogan, quote, "neither victory nor defeat," end quote, instead of the revolutionary defeatism of Lenin, and in not supporting Lenin's concept of a vanguard party. In general, Jenis argued Lenin had been right and Trotsky wrong. In Mandel's rebuttal to Jenis's second article, he claimed that Jenis had quoted Lenin out of context. He also reiterated his earlier argument that Lenin had changed his position, accepting Trotsky's ideas on the permanent revolution with the adoption of the Bolshevik Party's April Theses in 1917. He also refuted Jenis's claim that the regime established on November 7, 1917 had really been the kind of, quote, workers' and peasants' government, end quote, which Lenin had advocated before the April Theses, saying that it was in fact the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat with the support of the peasantry, end quote, which Trotsky had always argued for. In this article, Mandel indicated the current relevance of the somewhat esoteric arguments over Russian revolutionary history. He raised some fundamental questions about the future of the Trotskyist movement. He asked whether what he conceived of as the abandonment of the permanent revolution thesis of Trotsky by the Socialist Workers Party presaged the Socialist Workers Party's abandonment also of Trotsky's position in favor of a, quote, political revolution in the Communist Party-controlled states. In his peroration, Mandel said that, quote, our polemic has only one purpose, to save the Socialist Workers Party for revolutionary Marxism. For the American Revolution, for the World Revolution, but it will only be saved if it stops in time the march of certain of its leaders towards a rupture with Trotskyism, end quote. There were other polemics between the Europeans and the Socialist Workers' Party. These centered on greetings for a Socialist Workers' Party fraternal delegate to a Congress of the French affiliate of the United Secretariat. Criticism by Peng Shuxi of the position of the Socialist Workers' Party on Cuba, and disagreements over the position to be assumed with regard to the Solidarity movement in Poland and its suppression by the Polish government, among other things. A new turn in the controversy was the speech by Jack Barnes, Secretary of the American Socialist Workers' Party, before the Congress of the Young Socialist Alliance in December 1982, where he denounced most of those claiming to be Trotskyists as in fact being, quote, sectarians. This speech is discussed in some detail in another chapter. This controversy was probably one of the factors explaining the length of time between the 11th World Congress of 1979 and the 12th Congress in 1985. What did I say? Sorry, I'm fucking slurring my words here. This controversy was probably one of the factors explaining the length of time between the 11th World Congress of the United Secretariat in 1979 and the 12th one in 1985. Certainly, the issues raised in Barnes' in Barnes' speech impinged directly and indirectly on the 12th World Congress. The basic resolutions of the 12th World Congress dealt with, quote, the world situation, quote, the lessons and perspectives of the revolution in Central America, quote, political revolution and counter-revolution in Poland, quote, the relevance of the theory of the permanent revolution, and the notion of a workers' and farmers' government, quote, socialist democracy and dictatorship of the proletariat, bracket, a modification of the revolution presented to, but not fully adopted. I think it's supposed to be a resolution. It says revolution, but I think it's supposed to be a resolution. A modification of the resolution presented to, but not fully adopted by the 1979 Congress, to which we referred at length earlier in this volume. End quote. The present stage of building the Fourth International. In the discussion of these documents, there were two, quote, declared tendencies, end quote. One centering on the majority of the outgoing leadership of the USEC, the United Secretariat, the other led by the Socialist Workers Party of the United States. The Australian Socialist Workers Party, which withdrew from the ranks of international Trotskyism a few months later, generally stood alone at the Congress, presenting positions strongly critical of both the majority and of the Socialist Workers Party US and its allies. 5 new sections were accepted by the Congress, those of Brazil, Uruguay, Ecuador, Senegal, and Iceland. It was reported that the United Secretariat, quote, is today present in some 60 countries, end quote. There were about 200, quote, delegates, fraternal delegates, observers, and invited guests, end quote. One of the most serious organizational issues was that concerning the United States, where a large-scale purge of sympathizers with the United Secretariat majority and supporters of traditional Trotskyist positions had recently taken place. 3 organizations had been established by those expelled or who had resigned as a consequence of the expulsions. Delegates from 3 groups, the Socialist Workers Party, the Fourth Internationalist Tendency, and Socialist Action, were seated at the Congress, which resolved that the Socialist Workers' Party should permit return of the Fourth Internationalist Tendency and Socialist Action members to its ranks. Pending that outcome, the 2 groups, along with the Socialist Workers' Party, should be recognized by the United Secretariat as affiliated to it. It also is noted that the North Star Network, headed by ex-Socialist Workers' Party leader Peter Camejo, was no longer associated with the United Secretariat. Similar attempts were taken by the Congress with regard to Canada, where a split similar to that in the United States Socialist Workers' Party had taken place. Quote, formal relations were established, end quote, by the Congress of the Gauche Socialiste in Quebec and the Alliance for Socialist Action in Anglophone Canada. In the debates on programmatic issues during the Congress, the FIT and Socialist Action of the United States and the 2 new Canadian groups were aligned with the majority, which basically defended the traditional positions of international Trotskyism. The Socialist Workers' Party and its Canadian counterpart, on the other hand, were aligned with the minority which challenged those traditional positions. Conclusion. The United Secretariat of the Fourth International, established at the so-called Reunification Congress of 1963, continued to be for the next 2 decades the largest group claiming the heritage of the original Fourth International. It suffered 2 major splits, and by the early 1980s was threatened by a third, which might prove to be the most damaging of all, resulting from a challenge to the basic principles of international Trotskyism. Thanks for listening.